I'm about done with this. What's up guys, Dan here, Coalcracker Bushcraft. So you might have got to that point when you're removing bark from a tree limb or a log and it is tedious and it is difficult and you want to scream, so you just don't do it. But maybe you should do it, or maybe you shouldn't do it, I don't know. Should we be removing bark from projects? The answer is not super clear. It's sort of like my pond, a little bit murky. It just depends on the project and what your ultimate goal is with that. Now, if you've no reference, never heard of anything like this before, you might be thinking, well, I just take the bark off to make it look different. Just leave the bark on, it makes it easier. But here's the thing, leaving bark on a branch or a log will cause rot and decay. So if you are making a project, okay, in some circumstances, which we're gonna talk about all these different things, if you leave the bark on, it might destroy your project sooner than later. So why does bark on a cut piece of wood destroy the wood sooner than later? Well, it is because of moisture and humidity. What happens between the bark layer and the actual wood on the inside is that it traps a lot of moisture and it doesn't allow it to escape. So over time, if that bark just sits here and the wood's sitting here and all that moisture's in between, it begins to rot the bark and the wood, causing over time, of course, rot to the wood. And that's really what the project's more about. Less about the bark, more about the wood. With just that explanation, a lot of people would say, all right, well, I'm gonna make a project, I always gotta get the bark off now. But here's why I say you don't always have to do that. First, if it's gonna be a project such as like a tent peg, okay, so I'm just gonna carve this thing into a tent peg, that's somewhat, in my mind, like a reusable, renewable item. So going through the hassle of scraping it down and doing all that stuff, it really doesn't matter all that much, because the tent peg itself is probably going to get broke, damaged, or lost long before it actually gets to the point that it's going to rot. Second is, where are you going to be storing the project itself? So if you're going to be storing the project outside, let's say at a camp, and it's just going to be sitting out under a shelter or maybe exposed to the weather conditions, and you had to actually put some time in, let's say it was like a pack frame or a saw, like a buck saw or a bow saw that you actually carved out the frame itself. That stuff sitting out in nature, in the rain, in the snow, in the humidity of the summer, in the freezing temperatures of the winter, it really wreaks havoc with the bark layer and the wood. So getting rid of that bark is going to prolong that project. But if you're going to make something, in this case I brought this along, is a pack frame I made a few years ago, and then I just always kept this in my gear closet. So it was always with all my gear in a temperature controlled environment, aka my house. I never took the bark off, and it's fine, right? So what you're gonna see here is like the bark now is starting to actually crack and break away. I could just pick it off like this with my fingers, but the wood inside is perfectly fine. It's not rotted, and that is because there was no moisture, humidity, up and down levels, and it dried out really nicely while it was sitting at home. Now, to keep going along with that, rope spinners, we make rope spinners at our classes, and we generally would just let these at the camp that we always taught this skill at. So some of the rope spinners, like this one, is a few years old. You notice no bark on it. We removed all the bark, and the thing is still good to go. This thing literally doesn't see the inside ever. The wood's nice and dry, a few checks and cracks in it, but otherwise it's good to go. A little discoloration, and of course over time it's gonna rot if it's just laying on the ground and stuff, but we hang them up and they are generally good to go for a very long time. So let's look at this now on the other hand. So this is a cutting stump that we literally just cut towards the beginning of the summer this year. So it's only a few months old, and you can see what this thing actually looks like. Now, of course, when you lay a flat surface out, this is going to be susceptible to moisture and rain because it hits right on top of this. But if we start to look around the edges here, okay, what you're going to see, and I can start to pull this away, is look at this. There's bugs, there's lots of rot, okay? The wood's starting to get soft in here. You can see here, it's actually starting to like decay away. All right, so all around the edge of this thing, we're dealing with a lot of rot. So what happens then with stumps like this, if you had a cutting stump out for a while and the bark's on it, generally what's gonna happen is overuse a little bit. It starts to get mushy, chunks will break off the side, and then you end up having to discard it. All right, now let's look at another cutting stump. Here's a cutting stump right here. This is one that we removed the bark off of. This is, I know for a fact, a few years old because I'm the one that put it here. I use it for videos and stuff sometimes. So this cutting stump, we have no rot, okay? Maybe a little bit starting to happen here, a little bit more towards the bottom because it always sits on the ground and susceptible to moisture. But the sides of this and the top of this thing are actually really good, all right? So we noticed there's no rot, nothing bad happening here. And then I had to show this one because this one itself is 4 years old now, okay? It is not rotted. It is a shave horse and it is in perfect shape. You notice we don't have any bark left on this thing, okay? We scraped all of that off during the building and construction phase of this thing. Now, of course, it's sitting out, like I said earlier. This sitting out in the weather year-round, in and out, in and out. Sooner or later, right, the wood is gonna rot. It's not pressure treated or anything like that. It's lumber off the landscape. But the fact is, these things hold up way longer than if you would have left the bark on. This thing, if the bark was on, would already have been rotted. We probably would have had a lot more cracks. Maybe some of the legs would have been totally shot and we would have had to replace them. But in this case, still good to go. All right, and quick, just one more example, all right? So here's a tripod. Now, to me, these are a renewable type thing. I can make one of these. It doesn't take long. Yes, it's a little bit of work, but it's not like a sawbuck or a pack frame or a saw, anything like that. So something like this, you put it together, you use it a while, right? You get maybe about a year out of it or something like that. Now, this thing we made last year at the Bushman class, so that was only last December. And watch, this leg already, I'm gonna tell you already, I could probably start to break that because you can see that this thing is getting super weak. See, that was way easier. Look at, and you're gonna see the rot in between the bark, okay, and the wood itself. Look, I'm just breaking that wood off. All right, so that's today's educational tip for everybody from Coalcracker. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, hit like and subscribe down below. You can also check us out over at coalcrackerbushcraft.com for our products, our blog, and all of our classes. And then I think that's about it. So I'm gonna get back to scraping my stick, and then until the next video, stay in the woods.